You are listening to I Am Interchange.
I am Interchange.
I am Interchange.
I am Interchange.
Fostering curiosity, education, and empathy by exploring the controversial and the provocative.
I am Interchange.
The Governor's Office of Economic Development is the state's lead organization to help businesses succeed in Montana. I can personally attest that they take this mission to heart. Having started multiple businesses here in Montana, I know that my first call after I've formulated my next project idea is the Governor's Office of Economic Development. They have helped me shape my ideas, offered practical advice, and surrounded me with a network that provides continuous support to this day. Welcome to the I Am Interchange Exchange podcast, where artists, activists, and entrepreneurs with different ideas and perspectives come together and address multiple topics and provoke thoughtful dialogue. Today's topic: can and should wildfires be managed? At the time of this recording, we were entering into another epically historic fire year across the western United States and Canada. Environments from urban neighborhoods to our national parks were threatened by fires, burning more intensely than we've seen in this lifetime. And the debate rages on. Should humans be doing more to manage these wildfires before and during their burn? Or should we decide that 100+ years of fire suppression has led us down the wrong path, and it's time to get out of the way of the natural process? As with anything this complicated, no one is 100% wrong, so we had to take a closer look. We can take tonight's main question two ways. Can wildfire be managed, or should wildfire be managed? This conversation is not one about details of firefighting, logging, or forest conservation efforts. It's about entire ecosystems and community vitality, and how fires have a dynamic impact on both. Wildfires put economic security and even human lives on the line. So it's no surprise, perspectives on how to manage and control them evoke strong emotions. But as with all Interchange panel discussions, we focused on bringing balanced and informed perspectives to the table. We hope you'll learn something new, or have an opportunity to listen deeper on this challenging and sensitive topic. Walking us through the complexities of wildlife dynamics, fire management, and the impacts fires have on habitat and communities, we brought together an experienced panel of folks with epic careers in wildlife suppression, wildlife conservation, tourism, and community-level economies. We have Steve Kelly, an artist and environmental activist who is running in the primary for Senate in Montana as a Green Party candidate.
We are the problem because we can't accept what forests do naturally. And we accommodate people because people give us money, we collect taxes, it's a system. We're involved in a system that presumes that we have an influence over almost everything.
We have Gary Peck, a logger and forester who works with private landowners to manage forests and help fires burn at a lower intensity if they come through.
Fire is a disturbance, so it kind of starts a new forest, and logging can mimic that, can start a new forest. A little more controlled way.
Also here tonight is Jan Stoddard, who works with the Montana Department of Commerce in a division that develops grants to help communities and businesses that lose tourism revenue due to wildfire and smoke.
The problem we have sometimes from the tourism and outdoor recreation side is information and accurate information. So 3 years ago, I would have blamed the media for blowing up pictures of Montana on fire. And now it's every visitor that comes in with an iPod or a phone that wants to get the most dramatic shot they can. And what happens along the way is there's a lot of misinformation.
Dave Atkins, the founder of Tree Source, an online magazine focusing on urban and wild forests, as well as a forester by training with a 38-year career in the U.S. Forest Service fighting fires.
Interesting history. Through the 20s, 30s, 40s, there was a raging debate within the profession over should we be doing more prescribed fire in conjunction with forest management or putting them all out. And the put them out wing of the debate won out, and then that evolved to the late 60s and early 70s, the Wilderness Act and designation, and part of that was, hey, we need to be letting natural processes operate. And so that was the beginning of allowing fire to operate and using fire in that way.
And somewhat of a disclaimer, we also have my uncle, Paul Chamberlain. Paul worked in fire suppression for 40 years as a firefighter hotshot, making over 350 jumps as a smoke jumper.
There's no question that we suppressed a lot of fires. I've heard from academic sources sometimes that, well, we don't really catch these fires. Well, we do. And it's in the 90th percentile of how many fires we catch. Late mid-career, we started realizing, questioning, are we really doing the right thing? And by the end of my career, it was very clearly we had a tiger by the tail. Do you let go? Well, no. When they've tried to just let fire do its things, that had unintended consequences also.
There's a lot of gray area around how, why, and can we manage wildfires. What does the truth mean? I've found that the more perspective we include, the more adequate and accurate our map becomes around topics. Let's start out with a little history on the Great Fire of 1910. It burned approximately 3 million acres in just over 2 days. Washington, northern Idaho, and western Montana, killing about 87 people, mostly firefighters. Highlighting firefighters as public heroes while raising national awareness of nature conservation. I'm hoping that Paul and Dave might talk a little bit about what's happened since then.
Yeah, it was a seminal event in the Forest Service. It was an agency that was only 5 years old, and fire became the evil monster, and the goal for the agency became to put them out. And today we're wrestling with the results of that. And interesting history, I mean, through the 20s, 30s, 40s, there was a raging debate within the profession over should we be doing more fire, prescribed fire in conjunction with forest management, or putting them all out. And the put them out wing of the debate won out, and then that evolved to the late 60s and early 70s, the Wilderness Act and designation, and part of that was, hey, we need to be letting natural processes operate. And so that was the beginning of allowing fire to operate and using fire in that way.
Since then, we've really struggled, and the other thing is we became aware of the natural growth, and if you're looking outside your window, you can look at the conifer trees and see that inch or two of growth on each tree and multiply that times the acreage, or that many trees in an acre, and then the acreage of the national forests, and then go through the acres that are actually burned or treated with fire, and we realize we are way out of step with what needs to be done. Some of the logging forest interests, people who I would sometimes disagree with in terms of land management decisions, at the beginning of the Forest Service disagreed with Gifford Pinchot and the evil nature of fire. They used it to sway the public, and some of the land managers knew better that, you know, fire has a natural role here. So the work that Gary's doing and Dave is doing, I think, is an important part of the ultimate formula of how we address this issue. When I started in fire, there was no field of study called fire ecology. And today it's fascinating, some of the research Steve was just talking about that they're doing today. It's just wonderful to see what the whole real story is on fire, the natural role of fire. But one thing I want to add to this, as a fire manager, as a operations section chief responsible for firefighter safety, and by the way, I'm not working for the government at that moment, I'm working for the parents and the children and the wives and husbands of these firefighters. You know, what if the wind comes up? And I'm looking at every firefighter every minute of the day, and it takes an emotional toll. Where are these people standing in the event the wind comes up? And that the wind that the 1910 fires represent is always in the back of your mind. And it's a scary deal.
We thought we could manage the whole thing and regulate it. And that was a bit of hubris there. And so to me, the evolution and the fire science kinds of things, and I think where we are today is we're now working at how do we live with fire? Because fire is going to be here, always will be. And so the question that we as a society need to deal with is how do we live with fire, minimize the risks to values, and then take advantage of what fire can do for those other values, the biodiversity that Paul was just starting to talk about.
That's where we are right now. We have a tiger by the tail. If you don't suppress some of these fires, they're only going to get bigger, and then you have this bigger source of ignition, and then what happens in late August, the wind comes up.
I've talked to people at pretty high levels in Washington, D.C., and they're going to tell you management is the key to everything. And this is what I think I disagree with most on a philosophical level, is that forests exist. It's self-evident that they don't need us. And we are the problem because we can't accept what forests do naturally. And we accommodate people because people give us money, we collect taxes, it's a system. We're involved in a system that presumes that we have an influence over almost everything.
Well, you're running for Senate, right?
Right.
So as a politician, what do you tell concerned citizens whose jobs and homes are at risk?
I tell them there's a forest there, and if they want to live in the forest, that they need to accept there's a risk. There has to be some personal responsibility to living in the woods. People have been conditioned since the great 1910 fire that we can do it. We can put them out. We can save you. And this is not just about fire. This is, there's management going on all the time. Human resource. You're a human resource. I'm a human resource. We're managing everything. I actually personally think that there is no need for a lot of this management, that the forest is going to be fine. We just have to accept that there's a forest that does what forests do. And that's a really hard thing to accept. It's like trying to accept yourself. You are you. Everybody's running around trying to be somebody else. But the forest exists the way it is. It's always been there, except we were talking about the last ice age. There were no forests here. But since then, there have been forests. And the best forests that anybody ever saw was probably Lewis and Clark.
Dave, you blew my mind with this. How many different kinds of forests are there? Mm-hmm. How many different kinds of forests, management agencies and kinds of forests are there?
A whole bunch. So you've got private lands, but within the private lands, you get family forest owned, from 20 acres to a couple thousand acres. You've got corporate forest lands, and their primary purpose is wood production, and that's what drives their management. And then you've got state lands, and often state lands, they're public, but they have a mandate for returning money in support of schools. And then you've got Park Service. So that's an agency with some forests in a lot of that, and that's preservation and natural processes. Then you have the Forest Service, which has a whole mix of lands under their umbrella from wilderness, where we're supposed to, as much as possible, allow natural processes to operate, to municipal watersheds and production of wood, and so to me I
have a couple more to add.
Okay.
I've got national forests, tribal lands, fish and wildlife parks, and city.
Right.
That's a whole lot of different agencies, and do they all manage things differently?
That's a yes and no. The yes part is many of those have different mandates, different goals and objectives in law that direct them. And so they're going to be managing to meet that. The no part is there are certain, basic elements of forest ecology, fire ecology, that all of those managers have to recognize and deal with. And so there's my yes and no.
So say a fire starts on the tribal lands, then it rolls into a corporate forest, then it goes into the national park. Do property lines matter when managing the fire that crosses them?
Yes, because you're talking about a bigger fire, so those the incident command team will work with each of those agencies, and those land managers will provide direction in terms of how that fire is going to be managed.
There are whole ecological systems that are dependent upon large areas of burnt dead trees with a lot of snags. And it's a rich ecological environment. And we treat it like it's salvage, or it's trash, or it needs to be replanted, or we need to build roads in there and get it's before it loses its value. Well, its value is in being part of nature.
The kind of fire that is acceptable depends on the type of forest and what our goals and objectives are. When that really hot and dry condition comes and the fire is there, it'll be able to burn through my land with relatively minor effects. And so that to me is that point of living with fire and having forest lands that are meeting multiple objectives and building resilience into that forest so that when those conditions exist that we can't stop the fire, we can live with the results of it.
The Nova Cafe, located in the heart of historic downtown Bozeman, Montana, is locally owned and serves up the best breakfast in town. Personally, I recommend the Baja. I love supporting the Nova Cafe because they support local artists, farmers, producers, and of course, I Am Interchange. How does climate change add to our projections and wildfire policy? We'll turn to Dave to kick off this conversation about how changing weather systems are setting up conditions we haven't dealt with before, and how we can plan for and respond to the changes we're seeing.
We can expect more of those high pressures with the melting of the Arctic ice sheet, changing the reflectance. All the models are indicating that we're going to probably have more of these high pressures. It won't be every year, won't be all the time, but we can anticipate more of those kinds of things. And so from my perspective, I think there's a sense of urgency in adding to that mosaic, to doing the harvest and prescribed burns, the prescribed burns, that then will allow the fire managers, when they get out of control, to have something to anchor to. In the context of climate change, we need to be restoring that mosaic and using a variety of tools, including wildfires.
Because if you take a look at Montana and its changing revenue picture right now, where there's declining revenues from traditional extractive mining, minerals, forestry, there has to be something else that comes in and substitutes for that to keep our economy healthy. For us, for tourism, we know fires are inevitable. They're part of the process. The problem we have sometimes from the tourism and outdoor recreation side is information and accurate information. So 3 years ago, I would have blamed the media for blowing up pictures of Montana on fire. And now it's every visitor that comes in with an iPod or a phone that wants to get the most dramatic shot they can. And what happens along the way is there's a lot of misinformation.
Let's talk about all the smoke and impact on human health. August last year was miserable. It killed tourism. It killed my lungs. Does my health outweigh the need for a healthy forest?
Leave. Take a break. You know, you don't have to stay and breathe air. I mean, really, we're mobile. We have money. This is a pretty upwardly mobile community. Everybody could just vacate, basically, if they want to. That's why we have all these extras, right? The extensions of man. We have cars. We have bicycles. We have airplanes. It's like, go somewhere.
It is going to happen, and we have to live with the smoke, and we have to accept that. And so, and that's a significant social shift that we need to do culturally. But we can influence the amount of smoke. There's some recent research that's been done that the amount of smoke coming out of a wildfire is about 17 times the amount of particulate matter that comes out of a prescribed burn. And that's directly related to the amount of wood that gets consumed. And so if you've got a mosaic across the landscape with areas that have recently burned or recently have been harvested and that fuel loading is low, then the amount of smoke is going to be much less. And so by doing prescribed burning and harvesting and managing a portion of that land so that we can have wood products that is a carbon sink, that is a renewable material as opposed to steel and concrete and aluminum. We're dependent on the forest. The forest doesn't need us. To Steve's point, it will, go along just fine without us. But there are tremendous things that we rely on from the forest, from recreation, whether that's, hunting and fishing, birding, mountain biking, hiking, all of those things. But also our water systems, the 10-mile watershed for Helena, Sourdough Creek here. We're dependent on the forest for a lot of different things. And so we are going to manage, and we need to manage a portion of that. And then we have wilderness areas, national parks, where we pretty much let the system operate. And to me, the important thing is we've learned a lot about how the system operates. And if we mimic that, then we can still have a lot of the benefits that fire can provide without as much of the detriments, whether it's smoke or threats to private property.
It's time to pivot to another question that examines how wildfire and the smoke from those fires impacts our collective ability to make money with tourism and other vital industries that rely on clean air, pristine views, and seasonal weather. We'll start with Jan Stoddard to explain on how communities are currently being impacted and what, if anything, we can do to make our economies more resilient to wildfire.
It was sort of interesting because 2017 was actually, across the entire state, the best year we ever had for tourism. And forgive a couple numbers, but there were 12.4 million visitors that came here, non-resident visitors. And there was actually an 11% increase in the spend for those visitors over the prior year. So across the state, it was a banner year for tourism. However, if you went to localized areas, if you're in Lincoln, if you're in Sealy Lake, if you're in the Bitterroot, if you're in Kalispell and Whitefish, that weren't being evacuated, but the smoke was so intense that they couldn't hold outdoor recreation events, what happened was they could have generated more. There was a report from the Institute for Tourism Recreation Research that estimates we could have had another 800,000 non-resident visitors hit the state and another 24 million in additional revenues if for those weeks, those communities weren't as impacted. we really proactively try to educate people that it's part of the Montana experience.
It's how well the story was told that defined the experience of the people that were attending that session. And I'm hearing a parallel here with this. You can hear the nuance in this issue we're debating. And maybe Jan's job is to make sure those stories are out there, that they're great, that they're nuanced, and people come to Montana had no idea they were going to get such interesting insights. And you know, if this room was on fire, as a seasoned firefighter, assuming we're out in the woods, the wind's coming from Tate, fire's over here. Well, I'm going to start on this side and stay out of the smoke until I get it pinched off over here. See what I'm saying? We can be smarter in how we manage the smoke and the tourists who are coming to visit that smoky area.
But it seems indisputable that the most evocative aspect of managing wildfire is how it impacts us on a very personal level. When flames take away the homes and businesses we've spent our lives working for. As with any interchange discussion, the perspectives on this issue are varied, and the conversation is active. We'll start with Jan's on-the-ground perspective from working with homeowners and businesses on the front lines.
I attended some incident commander meetings to get the right information out. And I heard the discussion that went on at that meeting, because literally they had done aerials and started to talking about people that intentionally had built in the woods, to your point, Steve, but had not created a barrier of safety around their property. And there'd been extensive education by the local Forest Service to tell people that, you know, it would not be safe. And there was actually a subdivision in West Yellowstone that would not be safe, that people would have to pull out of. And listening to those discussions about safety and being able to, and what was the responsibility of the firefighters going into those areas, I suddenly became much less sympathetic of people that build in fire-prone areas but do not have defensible space.
You know, if you're gonna live in the forest, on the edge of the forest, you need to accept responsibility. There's great research that's been done in terms of what you build your house out of, how you manage your landscape, that can very dramatically reduce the risk. You know, I don't think you ever get to 100% eliminating that risk, but you can dramatically reduce that risk. And so my sympathy factor depends on how much responsibility people take for their place.
So once it burns through, I mean, it's fire safe for quite a while. So I wouldn't hesitate to rebuild.
You can't hardly live anywhere in the West, and actually most of the Southeast, without being in a fire environment. But what we've done in the heart of Bozeman, Missoula, Helena, we've modified the environment enough that it's not very flammable. And we've put enough, you know, fire suppression capability, hose fire hydrants, you know, so that we can mitigate that risk. And so it's the people on the edge that have to accept a lot more personal responsibility.
I feel for the landowner. I know how the homeowner, I know how hard they work. You know, I own a home. Both people working. Nobody has time to do some of this restoration or can't afford the contractor. I think Steve's position, you know, I bump into it. Friends, I'm not that far from it sometimes, you know, well, fire's natural, my home's not natural, let it go. I'm not quite there. We have a lot of people living in that fringe area. But, you know, it became very clear after some tragedy fires that those homes will grow back. These lives of civilians or firefighters won't. And so it's water off a duck's back, my decision to get crews out of there if it wasn't safe. And what I was using is what I use for firefighter safety. If the firefighter has a safety zone we can operate out of, we can get pretty darn close. Okay, homeowner, provide us the safety zone. And I got to team teach with a very fine structure fire specialist out of Southern California, out of LA County, who we team teach these. And And the safety zone was there. Well, who can provide that? It's the neighborhood. It needs to give us that safety zone where we can put the lookouts, escape routes. We'll bring the communications. And then we can get in quite close. The complexity of suppressing, sometimes the fire goes through and we think of a wave of fire burning all these houses, but it really isn't. This is what Dave was alluding to. 20 minutes later, this fire burns because there's a fence connected to the eaves of the house and all this stuff. This technology is getting better and better. We need to educate people. I turn to Jan. Get that word out there and then get them to give us the safety zones, and then maybe we can help them with normal crews. Maybe not parking a big, what a firefighter would call a pavement queen structure engine at every house. That's where you, the taxpayers, paying for an awful lot of our expense. But four hotshot crew members with backpack pumps can do a world of good if there's a safety zone they can work out of.
And nowhere does that conversation about personal and collective impacts on wildfire become more controversial than the discussion of how and where logging should play a role in our management policies. Steve and Gary led this discussion with divergent perspectives on the approach we should be taking to reduce fire risk and earning income from our forests.
I think Montana's best interest is in leaving the trees stand and leave them where they are.
Why?
And that's why because the Department of Commerce seems to think the tourists are coming to see something interesting.
So we're cutting down all the tourist areas?
I think we're killing the golden goose.
I live in Missoula, Patty Canyon, Blue Mountain, Rattlesnake, primary recreation areas. And we've had logging projects in there that have reduced the fire risk, that covered the costs of removing that material. It provided material to mills to make valuable products, and the recreation was enhanced.
Helena clear-cut their watershed to protect it, and there's no recreation going on those clear-cuts, I guarantee you, because it's just one big strip mine.
We are paying for the sins of our fathers. I remember the log decks at Coos Bay, Oregon. All those logs were shipped offshore under the guise of providing jobs for the loggers in the woods. Why did those logs leave these shores without being turned into lumber or furniture or modular houses or something if they were interested in jobs? And same thing's going on today, except we just don't have the forest timber stand we had. So I joined Steve in being suspect. Gary earlier made the comment that the environmental community is raising the cost of the Forest Service to administer sales, and some of these sales are done by designed by moral people, doing the best they can with their training and their commitment to forest health and fuels. They understand these things. Again, I have to be a suspect a little bit that a small percentage of the units are being challenged, and they're challenged because the environmental community finds fault and has a voice, and I believe in protecting that voice. Already, though, you've heard me say numerous times the important work that people like Gary is doing in providing the answers, and we're just not there yet. And how do we integrate all these things that we're fighting about into, cohesive, let's get together and work on it, because everybody has part of it. And then again, Tate's on the right track. Let's get this dialogue going. We've got a long ways to go.
So we have hundreds of pages of environmental assessment for a project in the wildland-urban interface on Forest Service land, on DNRC land, on tribal land, anywhere you need to do NEPA or MEPA, environmental policy review. But you can't read the risk assessment. There isn't a paragraph, there isn't a sentence, there isn't a percentage of risk number that is derived from probability and consequence the way insurance companies do this all across the world. And that's what I'm getting at, is we're doing operations, huge operations, miles from the nearest structure to prevent fires from encroaching into the urban areas, but we don't know the risk. And I think that's just something that's got to change, because nobody knows. including the agency that's proposing to spend millions of dollars to protect us from fire.
Zocalo Coffee House is the official coffee house of I Am Interchange. It's the perfect atmosphere to grab coffee with a friend or to work remotely. Even though I've built my dream workspace at Blunderbuss, I still find Zocalo to be the perfect, productive spot when I need a change of scenery. We'll close this episode with a reflection from our panelists on the perspectives that challenge them the most.
The idea that whatever the forest does and however it happens is okay because, there's over 7 billion people on this planet, projected to be close to 10 billion by 2050. We've got to figure out how to live on this blue dot sustainably, and forests and a portion of those forests being able to provide a renewable, sustainable material that actually pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it in building and structures is, in my mind, part of that solution. And so that's an important component. The natural areas, the parks, the wilderness areas are an important part of that component. And I guess to me, that's part of the dialogue that we socially need to come to grips with is what's that balance and how do we mix that together?
We are polarized in our thoughts, and it's hard to get past what your experiences, to start talking about, I think, a future that can work amongst everyone.
I was challenged with what I came in with, an agenda I've been thinking about for a long time, and it's well represented here. And I'll expand upon it just a little bit, just for a couple minutes. I mentioned earlier that when I started, there was no such field as fire ecology, and now you can get a doctorate, and it's fascinating. It's infinitely nuanced. It's wonderful stories. And I think today, we're still lacking a field, I would call it fire economics. What is the big picture on a landscape scale? The research is small plots. How do we deal with it? How do we think in terms of the whole landscape to get these mosaics in the hundreds of acres, 1,000 acres? We can start playing a chess game of running fire others into them until we get this natural mosaic reestablished. But to get there, it's going to be darn expensive, and it's going to have to take every one of our skills. It's going to take all the researchers. It's going to take us understanding the habitat needs. Again, we haven't gotten back to habitat, but that's a huge moral imperative that we have influenced species. It has to integrate climate change. We can't agree on climate change. There's enough bad, corrupt, cruel, I think cruel, fake news out there around climate change. Sustainable forest, fuels, recreation and tourism, watershed, carbon dioxide, and jobs. How does all this stuff come together in a large, cohesive fire economics? I don't see the academic work quite at that scale yet. I think it needs to happen.
I think just the intractable position of humans believing we need to manage nature continuously. I mean, I came in with this problem, but if we think we can manage tourists, I mean, we've got a long way to go. We can't manage tourists. We can't manage forests. I mean, we can around the edges, but these things are going to just happen the way tourists stop and take pictures of bears and get pitched by bison. I mean, it's just the way things happen. And our lack of acceptance of that, I think, is my biggest challenge to this group and maybe in general.
All the challenges is try to understand each other's perspective and where they're coming from and try to work from there. I mean, things are dynamic in the woods and the environment. And you gotta accept that things are always changing, and you can't really rubber stamp that this is what has happened in the past, so this is what's gonna happen in the future. Everything's kind of changing. And the challenge is kind of recognizing that change.
As always, we learned a lot and we saw a little conflict, But most importantly, we moved the dialogue forward on an issue that impacts so many of us on a personal or social level. This episode was produced by Shannon Hughes, Tyson Lunn, and me, Tate Chamberlain. A special thank you to the Verge Theater, Bozeman Improverts, Josh Powell, Tyler Cross, Susan Karstensen, Piper Tatum, David Ashcraft, David Go, Liz Marici, Doug Warner, Britt Bodker, and Selena Byers. The music in this episode was produced by Nintendo. Sponsors for our events are the Montana Governor's Office of Economic Development, the City of Bozeman, 10 Directions, Hatch, the Yellowstone Theological Institute, Montucky Cold Snacks, the Nova Cafe, Zocalo Coffee House, Whistle Pig Korean, Dean Zesty Booch, Bliss, the Sola Cafe and Market, Shank Construction, Ben Johnson Shoots Photos, Loken Productions, Superfluous Industries, and Blunderbuss. That's all for today. Do you have an issue that's riddled by gridlock in your community? Check out our new website or email us at iaminterchange.org. That's iaminterchange.org.
I am Interchange.